All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a little quiet, but I'm very excited to have two members of the Null Signal Games development team to talk about the process and interesting cards from the development of Rebelling Without Rehearsal, the at time of recording most recent set. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stories of interesting cards and interesting processes from this process. Um, I'm going to have Safer introduce himself first. So if you don't mind saying hi and telling people a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Safer. I've been a part of the Null Signal Games development team for maybe something like 8 months now. I joined right as playtesting was ramping up for RWR after the Automata initiative was released. I've been a longtime Netrunner player, even though I took a break and then came back to the game to join Null Signal Games. I also do game design and other make other board games and card games and stuff. So a bit about myself.
Nice. And Testrunning, do you want to introduce yourself to the stream?
Yes, hello, I'm Testrunning, and it's a bit of a red herring because while I am now in the dev team, I have joined very recently just for Dawn. So I was not dev for RWR, but I have been playtester for Liberation and also RWR does. So I will talk a bit from the other side about the cards and processes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I think, maybe one place to start, is I think RWR was, at least from my experience and my understanding, as also being in the playtesting crew, like a set that was designed with as most sets are, with a mix of kind of some very top-down designs, and that can mean different things to different people, and then a couple more kind of, I guess, like mechanics first designs. And I think we were thinking about maybe starting with the Anarch side because that was an interesting set of cards and how that kind of evolved throughout testing. And Safer, I know you had a bit of a hand or a fairly close hand in a lot of the Anarch cards, so I might hand over the floor to you to kind of do some intro on them.
Yeah. So the Anarch package was in a not great state when I first joined. And Anarch doing a kind of a rework and analyzing every single card in the Sebastiao package and just taking nothing at face value and saying we can throw out anything that we want to. We should keep what's good, streamline what we can. So that was my very first project actually when joining Null Signal. So I basically came in, I read a lot of the feedback, which was, Sebastiao has this engine install runner kind of feel, but it was a lot of steps to get just a little bit of value. That was kind of what the feedback we were consistently hearing was. And my kind of first step was to just streamline as many of the cards in the package as possible. I think Friend of a Friend is a really great example of that. Friend of a Friend previously in testing had I think it had a recursion ability, if I'm not mistaken, attached to it. On the it had two click abilities. One was credit gain a tag, and the other one was a recursion ability. And this seemed like a very clear place to make this a easy economic card that made sense in the Sebastiao package, but didn't necessarily enhance regular Anarch.
Yeah. I wanted to say something as well because you mentioned that there was feedback on a lot of engine, and I think the feedback specifically was because I playtested a lot of Sebastiao, that you basically had a lot of requirements in your deck building to have enough connections, to draw these connections, then to take tags, and none of your payoff actually helped you win the game because you only had engine pieces and nothing that could interact with ice, no icebreaker that gives you basically tags without, apart from God of War, which is a bad icebreaker, or none of your connections really help you deal with ice or win the game. Yeah, and this got changed.
Yeah, so that's where crew came into being. That was actually one of the things that Took us a little while to kind of nail down was just what does crew look like, what does Sebastian need, and also thinking about how many slots we had. Like frequently as dev, we think about entire card packages, how they're going to be released, and we think about every slot in the product rather than a particular card. So, for example, friend of a friend that we talked about before, that slot is dedicated to an econ card for the Sebastian package. And crew was previously not slotted for Sebastian. And given all this feedback around Sebastian not being particularly streamlined and needing more, that was one of the kind of hard decisions where we had to go, you know what, Sebastian actually needs another slot. We need to cut an Anarch card to basically print the crew. And crew is, there's basically a lot counting, like the power of Sebastian we kind of knew like had to be related to the crew and how good the crew was.
Yeah, I think I'll say, just as like someone who was testing a lot against Seb, I wasn't particularly attracted by the Sebastian package that much. Was like, oh, he was doing a lot of like, I'm going to install this card to install this card, but they didn't really involve icebreakers. And so like the crew coming in and being like, okay, this is how you interact with ice. I thought it was interesting. Like the crew had a bunch of different variations once it was decided that the crew existed, right? That Seb needed to have a way to use tags to interact with ice. And so the crew was sort of this interesting, like, we want to make this card so that Seb interacts with ice. We don't want to make it too good for kind of the reg Anarch shells, but we also don't want to make the card like completely unplayable outside of them too, which is like it's a very hard kind of little window to kind of hit. Do either of you have any like memories of the other versions and like what kind of led us to this version of the crew, or led, you know, dev to this version of the crew?
Jared, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think the earlier versions of crew evolved a lot of Trojans actually, so you could only trash ice with Trojans on it, which wasn't really that helpful for SAP because again, it more deck building requirements. And then it like had sometimes sometimes it got changed. And it was iterated a lot, like where the tag is, what cost it had. There was a lot of worry about also like if tag me becomes too strong, because it's just been a problem in the past. But it was generally the feeling that the other tagging cards were not encouraging piling up tags enough, that crew would be a problem. And I think they're like the printed version was not the last version tested. Like they were like there were also other versions, but we decided in the end that they were like in some ways of a form worse than that one. So it was also one of the cards that just got tested at the latest, like shortly before deadline. There were a lot of new tries as well.
Yeah, this was a card that I think when we reworked the slot to make it not about Trojans, I think that the numbers may not be exactly right, but I think this is the form in which it came in. Oh no, you know what? There was a third ability. I remember. There was a third ability that made it even stronger. I remember the exact wording.
Oh, right. It had like some threat ability, right? That like
that's what it was.
It had like it was like a threat. Yeah. Actually, for a while I remember. Yeah, for a while it was just. Yeah. I think for a while the trash and ice was gated behind threat as well. And I remember that being very unsatisfying. Of like, I built my whole deck to trash ice, and now you're telling me I have to let the corpse score points first before I can do anything.
Yeah. So I think that was a version that we tried out later. Like, I think the version that I think it was maybe V5, maybe V6. I think it was V5, where it had a threat ability that was basically Ice Carver when you're tagged, and then also had the ability to, -2 by taking a tag. So it was like -2 most of the time, but then any time that you had threat, it might have been threat 3 at the time, threat 3 already turned on, then it became like 3 and ice just melted. And without any other additional cards, and that was clearly too good. We cut that ability, and the card kind of started to make Sebastião sing, at least in testing. I know that one of the modern developments is Devil's Charm, unsurprisingly, and that actually wasn't tested very much. Devil's Charm. I think there was full ice destruction where people were going really heavily into Devil Charm and Chisel Charm. Sorry, Devil Charm and Chisel, and Hippo. And I think I've also seen some people play around with that, but that like middle ground where you're just playing 3 Devil Charm and Crew and the Devil Charm to get through like all of the big ice that you need. That's not something that we saw too much in testing, but I also think that the Crew was frequently too strong in testing. So I guess kind of going back to what TR was saying was that in version 7, we tried out a couple like experimental things where we hello. So we tried out getting like switching the cost of the abilities. So I think the take a tag was what was required for ice destruction, but then you could pay to minus the strength of ice, and then it became like an economic like problem where it's like, oh, is it just I'm just pumping for efficiency if I'm using Crew with like credits, and then it just wasn't interesting anymore, like as a card. So yeah, this was one of those cards that we saw a lot of iteration on, and then we actually just eventually went back to that version 6 almost directly. I think the very last thing that we were testing was, should this remove from game or not? And that was definitely the hardest call to make. We were pretty confident that it should remove from game, and this is something that we do very frequently with testers is, we say, we're going to release this strong, like the version of the card in a strong point to testers, and everyone were like, well, this is concerning, this might be a problem. And we say, awesome. We also think that it may be a problem, prove it. And it just turned out that in testing, it was not proven that our remove from game was necessary. It may still end up shaking out that, if it was removed from game, the card could exist and not be banned, and maybe in the future in some world, Crew needs to have some sort of ban action taken against it. But I don't think that we're currently there, and removing from the game is something that we should try to avoid when we can, because it clutters like the game, like the physical board state when playing in person. And we kind of knew that it would just look weird printing Crew and having privileged access in the exact same set, and you're like, Sebastião, and you're like, what do I want to target with this privileged access? And it's like, well, I would love to target this ice destruction thing, but I can't because it removes from game.
Yeah, it felt like sort of, if this was an RFG, it would be kind of weakening one of the clear like themes of the set, and it felt like it was like if we have to RFG, that's like a really unfortunate last second balance decision, and not like here's how the set was designed. So let's try and like play with other numbers to see if we can make it so these two can interact with each other, which felt like the sort of intent of the set.
Our hope was that Crew was a relatively expensive effect for non-Sebastião decks.
All right, and now we're also joined by Divadus, who's joining us on the dev team. Would you mind introducing yourself quickly?
Hi there. My name is Divadus, or David. I'm the lead of the dev team, and it's great to be here. Thanks for doing this and allowing the player base to get a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at the process of RWR.
Yeah, it's really my pleasure. All right, so I think we talked a little bit before this, and I feel like we thought the next kind of interesting thing that was also still kind of we need to build a package that makes some sense was Nuim and the sort of Wayland card pool and how that makes sense. And so I'm going to turn it back to you guys, talk a little bit about the development history of Nuim and some of the cards in and around that ID. I guess we should have picked a speaker to go first.
That's fine. I nominate Dave. Because Dave is the one that had the idea to split the abilities.
Fantastic.
That's fascinating. I think you're right that it was me that had the idea. But yeah, so Nuvain is an interesting one. That, like basically any other cards that we're going to talk here, had a reasonably, what's the word? A flavorful, colorful history in terms of what went through a variety of different iterations. In the case of Nuvain, it went through a couple that were quite different to what you see presently. It was a decision that I made at some stage. There were iterations of an ability that looked vaguely similar to this. I don't remember the exact changes and back and forth, but ultimately, at some stage, when trying to come up with a wording that was clean, which there was a decent amount of if you do the first time that you do that, with couched within the trashing sentence, the whenever you finish resolving an operation, if it, you may trash that card and gain 2 credits if it was the first time. It ended up being just substantially cleaner to separate that into 2 sentences. I'm so glad we did. And 2 separate lines as well onto it. It's one where there were versions of this proposed which were whenever effects, but it was only gain 1. I think the thought was more commonly than not, it's going to be an effect that you aim to use every turn. But not only uncommonly would you use this multiple times in a turn. The 50 card thing, I think I'll pass that on to either Safer or TR to at least start that conversation, but it was a very conscious decision to make this a 50.
I think I can first talk about the 2 credits, because when first this it got introduced, I think was 45 and only gained 1 credit.
You're right.
And what's interesting about that is during playtest, it's not only about like how should cards be balanced, but the first and the most important step is like how are cards fun to use, and like the mini game of like looking at the top card and trashing was fun, but like just gaining 1 credit felt very not impactful, even if like maybe it was balanced, but at 45 and 1 credit, it didn't feel like you really did something with the ID. So then got added up to 2 credits, and then also the deck size got increased 1, because maybe 2 credits every turn is more powerful, and also because with trashing you basically get back to your default deck size in a few turns anyways.
Yeah, this ID was introduced to me as a 50 card ID. Like when I joined, this was 50 deck minimum and gained 2 credits, and trashed it. It always had that kind of trashing the top card of R&D aspect to it. So looking at it, it just kind of made sense. And I think it also played really well when it got bumped to 2 credits. I think a lot of, our feedback from playtesters was, whoa, this is a lot of money to be gaining. And usually when playtesters are framing things and not like it's broken or it's underpowered, but like, I don't know, this gains a lot of money, and that's like how they're phrasing it. Usually that means that players are like excited about the effect and it's engaging. And that's kind of what we want to see a lot of the time. And then it just kind of went down to refining the effect, making sure that it worked within our rules framework, making sure that the wording was as clean as possible. And it just so happened that breaking the abilities into 2 separate kind of like separating the credit gain and the trashing from the top of the deck, even though it has functional implications, like that was actually the cleanest way of doing it. And the functional implications were fine, or 5 to 10% of the gameplay associated with it.
Yeah, I think one thing, just like as someone who wrote the earlier versions of Nuim that we had for much of like the Automata initiative testing and stuff, was like it was often like, oh, trash a card from HQ to draw a card and then like flip a card in archives face up. Like the card went through a lot of changes, but like it had this kind of nice thing that I think sometimes happens in playtesting where like we kept feeling like it wasn't quite right. It was too similar to something else, or felt like its interactions were a little too niche, and like it got opened up in just the right way, and everyone's like, "Oh, this card's great." And now it's just a matter of making sure all the wording kind of works. And so this card was almost more like, okay, we have an idea of what the effect is, and then it's just a matter of tuning the exact text and the card pool just to make sure it's got enough kind of support in there, which I think is always a nice little thing that happens when that helps out.
And one of the cards that kind of came much later, that kind of got refined later, was the Basalt Spire. When the Basalt Spire was kind of like locked in, that's really when the archetype as a whole felt more cohesive.
Yeah, because what was that?
So the Basalt Spire went through a couple different iterations. Fairly, I think the one that sticks out to me was again a splitting of effects, because we were having a really hard time balancing the number of agenda counters being placed on the Basalt Spire. So the effect of returning a card from archives to HQ was always that effect was always there, and it always made sense for Nuim because you're trashing a whole bunch of things. But 2 counters on if the runner stole, it was just a lot of value, and very convenient. So much so that you almost like wanted the runner to steal it some of the time early on in the game, so you could get like combo pieces back. If there are agenda counters, you can time it to be whenever you would like, so it'd just kind of be this like oppressive thing that the corporation could hold over you. And then again, I think that this was a Dave idea, splitting the 2 effects so that it's when this agenda is stolen, you can add a card from archives to HQ. That all of a sudden felt like one, a proper mitigation, and you could bait the runner into taking it to get the effect from time to time. We've also seen plays where you have 2 Basalt Spires, they steal the first one and then you actually return the second one back to your hand, stuff like that. But it still gives you a reason to actively want to score out a 5/3. So the Basalt Spire is like one of the cards that I'm like, is an example of us getting, I think, a 5/3 done really, really well. And 5/3s, are some of the hardest cards, I think, to actually get right.
I can confirm that this one I do actually remember doing that. It's pretty critical, this one, when I know that the on steal effect was always, I believe it was always weaker than the on score effect. but I believe it was 2 counters on score. I think at some point it was
Was
3
it
counters
one?
on score. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it was
2 to
3.
3 counters on.
Oh, you're
Yeah, sorry, go
right.
ahead. You remember.
Yeah,
I think it was 2 to 3 counters on score and then 1 counter on steal.
yeah, for actually I pulled up the version sheet, and yeah, there was several versions where it was 3 on score and 1 counter on steal. And from what I remember, it was like this just makes the punitive dot deck, and when you couple this
Yeah.
with Nuvum's ability to just print a lot of money, it was like,
Yeah.
oh, so if the runner doesn't have, like, Nuvum can generate 30 credits in 5 turns, so the runner
Yeah.
has to be able to do that, or they can just score Basalt Spires off the board for free.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think, and there were admittedly other versions where this also had a click cost attached to it, this ability to recur cards, which was noted as just making this card considerably clunkier, and obviously removes entirely the ability to save a paid ability speed agendas, which is part of what is compelling about scoring this in the first place. But yeah, generally speaking, the having such a degree of flexibility about when you can get back the cards that you're looking for made it such that on steal, this really couldn't be something that you could just, cool, thanks for stealing that. I wanted you to steal that because I have this this effect now that I have, like, at perfectly timed at any point in the game you've enabled my game plan. And again, the self synergy as well with punitive Counter-Strike.
Yeah, it was basically functioning as an archive memories reprint that you
Yeah.
didn't mind getting stolen. So
It didn't cost a click. I'm remembering there was someone in SBT, and I am struggling to remember who it was. It might have been D. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. But I think I'm looking back at the version history now, and I'm like, oh, you're right. It was 2 counters on score, 1 on when it was stolen, and that reads clean enough that we probably would have kept it. But I think that someone in SBT brought it up like this in like the prison obelisk was going to be problematic, and then changing the timing of it is what made it a lot, like, not become an issue in that list in particular.
yeah, I think that was a I do remember D doing some prison op testing, and I think some other SBT testers were also kind of trying to grind it out. And I think, like, yeah, I'm glad that the Basalt Spider ended up this way, because it does feel like it's a pretty strong 5/3, but it also feels like it goes very well in Nuvum without enabling some strategies that tend to be a little bit less well loved, I guess. Like, it does feel like you want to try and include a way to score this in your corp deck, rather than just kind of leave it to be stolen at some point.
Yeah. I sorry, just to also, I don't think I made this point particularly well. Part of the thing before, when it placed counters on steal, it meant that you could have one stolen early on during the game, and then you've got this activated for the rest of the game. So it's like, in a way that it just, oh, thanks for stealing that. I wanted you to steal it at some point, and that's fantastic for me because you've turned on my win condition. As opposed to the current iteration, which is, it's definitely you can't just go, leave a server open with knowledge that, well, I want you to steal this eventually. The newer iteration is actually, I would argue, more skill testing in terms of for the moment, I don't want you to get this because I don't have the cards I want in the bin that will help me. So having to play more strategically as to I can afford to let my Basalt Spire get stolen now.
Yeah, no, I think that is a big difference. I guess I might move us on. We had pulled out some HB cards, though I think we're starting to get out of the territory of like, oh, we were designing this whole archetype, and more the like we were trying to make these cards fit in the set.
Yeah, so working prototype is actually, previously I talked about card, like how we think about not individual cards necessarily, but like card slots within the product. And working prototype actually was previously a different card that we actually all kind of really, really liked. It is a card that we may, it's a card that we may see in the future.
Like
so
that,
I'm not
knowing. Yeah. Oh yeah.
I had forgotten
Yeah,
about that card, and then I'm like, oh right, I just want that card back so badly.
Yes, exactly. I think that is all of our positions. That card in particular was a really great card that we started to realize was not too unlike a Rashida. was our lesson. So that was the other slot, and we were like, can we allow for Rashida copy 4, 5, and 6 in a corp dominated meta? Probably not. So at the time, the recommendation was, hey, hey, on dev, we're telling like design this. We really like this, but these are our learnings from it, and we don't think that we should actually be printing this card right now. We want to see this card in the future, but not right now. And so that meant there was an open slot for a brand new design, and the whole res deres package was something that we wanted to explore more of. We knew that it could use some more support. We knew that it was kind of missing like an economic piece. The Lakshmi trigger, the Lakshmi Smart Fabrics trigger, was something that hasn't been explored by NSG much at all. So that was like kind of where this card slot started. It was like this mixing of like a Lakshmi Smart Fabrics and like a Regolith.
I can tell a bit about the balancing of the card because at the beginning the second ability was much stronger, needing less counters and giving more money. And I think from the initial design, it looked like, if you spend X more counters, you should get like multiple times the money as well. But the other way to look at this card was, like in playtesting, I realized the click compression to just spending one click and gaining more credits is worth it a lot, even if it spends a lot more counters. So even disregarding the adding resources back to the stack, just for the economic part, sometimes you just want to use a second ability, even if it costs a lot of counters.
Oh yeah, it was 4 counters for a long time, wasn't it? And it was like 4 counters gained 7.
I think it started out with 9 actually.
I think this is a thing that all of you can thank TR for saving us from.
Yeah, this is definitely one where a lot of concerted testing had to go into making this the numbers on this look right. This is one on top of the story that Safer mentioned here about the particulars of this design fundamentally changing from something previously to what it is now due to wanting more support for the DRes package. In terms of the particulars of how many credits are gained for each of the different actions, as well as how many counters are required, was very much down to the playtesting process, which I'm certainly very grateful to y'all and the rest of the team, which I hope to shout out at least several times during this, as our playtesters are fantastic. So part of the reason, a very significant part of why we can end up with exciting designs is because rigorous testing makes for better cards. better, more interesting, more compelling cards.
Yeah. Should we talk about the other card, which I feel like has a very I think has also an interesting story, but I feel like a pretty different one. This is Sorkamon Blade. If I can spell it.
Carbon Blade.
Sorakaban.
S-O-R-O. S-O-R-O.
Sorakaban Blade.
Yeah, I often get confused about S-O-R-O or S-O-R-A.
Mm.
So, from what I remember, this card for a long time, I feel like was like a completely different card, and I feel like this was one of those ones that kind of got figured out with the rules team a lot more so than other stuff. Like it had some very every sub was if you did not trash a X on the previous, then trash a, or if there are no X installed, do a thing, and so it was a very different card for a lot of testing.
So this card was, this card had a very simple concept. This was a bottom-up design in that it was a mechanical design kind of first, and the entire idea was kind of like a waterfall. Trash a resource, the thing that's usually the easiest for the corporation to trash, then trash a hardware, which is ironically the hardest thing, and then trash a program. And it was always supposed to be kind of in that order. But the way that we worded it originally was the first sub was trash an installed resource. And then the second sub was if there are no installed resources, trash a hardware. And then the last sub was if there is no installed pieces of hardware, trash an installed program. And so there were all of these weird board states where, okay, which subs do you need to break to understand the waterfall was way more complexity than the card should be. So we tried out a whole bunch of different kind of sub wordings. And then eventually when discussing it with the rules team, I don't remember who actually had this idea, but it might have been a playtester. It might have been someone on the rules team. It might have been someone in dev. I don't remember. But effectively, the idea was, what if we just create a clause at the top that does that restriction, and then we get back to that really nice waterfall instead of all of this jumbled wording in the subs themselves. One of the other things that was super relevant in the development of this card was how punishing should a face check be versus how taxing the ice can be, and finding that balance with this card was quite difficult with the other wordings, because if you ran into Soracon Blade and had exactly 3 things installed and couldn't break it, you could just lose your entire board as the runner. But it was not a very taxing piece of ice once you started to get other things on your board. So even if the first sub fired and it trashed an installed resource, you wouldn't have to break the other 2 things. Or you just have to break the first sub so that you didn't trash a resource. So finding that basically that top kind of piece of text, one served as a hush counter, which is kind of awesome, but to actually make allowed us to find the balance between hey, this has an appropriate amount of face check and is also appropriately taxing for its cost.
Yeah, I think my experience of that cost change of with the version that was trash installed resource, if there are no installed resources, trash a hardware, if there are no installed hardwares, trash a program, did often mean that this was a forward res sentry that the runner then broke for 1 credit. Which was just so. I remember actually the two of us having an argument where I'm saying that's okay because the face check penalty is so high that runners have to play around it differently, and then it's just really bad in the late game, and that's okay because HB already has other really good sentries, so it's fine. And I'm glad that I mean, this is a great. I'm glad you guys don't listen to me that much, because I think this card ended up in a much better place.
We do listen to you. We just don't always take.
We just filter
We
it
don't always
through
take your-
certain channels.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't exclusively take your suggestions for solutions.
So I think another thing that y'all have touched on has been the finding the right balance between blowout and like blowout, face check punishment, and taxation later on. And certainly earlier versions of this, where they had the if cascading effect, could at times result in like nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing happened. With this, it was just absolutely not just trivial to break, but it didn't even do anything. And then obviously later on, you only had to break the subroutines like that you chose to. You only had to break one of them, and then the rest, the cascade, didn't happen. It was the massive blowout. I guess it sort of recalls, even though like it didn't immediately win the game, in the same way that just having a tiny mind blank temporarily, a Saisentan, Jinteki
Oh, okay.
Saisentan would do. But yes, I mean, Janus, I wouldn't use the comparison because, this was always,
I don't know why my mind went there,
11
not
or more
Saisentan,
credits cheaper to res. But yeah, Saisentan, in terms of Saisentan is, oh, I hit this at the wrong time, and I'm dead. As opposed to Sorakaban, sort of Carbon Blades, which was never the game immediately ends, but the blowout could be significant enough that, oh, you actually just trashed 3 of the things that I had res for 3 to 4 credits total on your side. And that's actually it's very, very hard for me to recover from this now. Like the hit was just absurdly high. So definitely we ended up leaning more toward, hey, let's have this actually be a relevant piece of ice later on, while still being punishing early, but it's no longer very heavily weighted toward the early blowout or an early face chuck. Which I think was the right call.
Yeah, I think it
so.
also.
I think I was going to add that, I think it's a cleaner card, and I think if we abstract this, what we're talking about is the card's value floor versus the card's value ceiling, and the previous versions of this card, that gap was massive, and when that gap is really, really large, the result on an ice that has face check was either going to be, it doesn't see very much play competitively, but when it does, it just feels it feels like you got for lack of better phrasing. It doesn't feel good for either player in that state. And so
one of the things that we definitely a phrase that we have to temper in terms of when we hear it coming out during the playtesting process is that of unfair. And there are situations in Netrunner that very much feel unfair on one side, but I think for the game to work, there have to be situations that feel unfair sometimes. That feel like, oh, I don't know what. Ooh, that feels like there wasn't much I could do to interact with. I think in order for powerful effects to get printed, some degree of subversion of either the typical rules or expectations, the unspoken rules of how gameplay is meant to work, get in some way subverted or bent. But this was, the feedback of unfair cropped up a decent amount. And when that tends to be recurring feedback, you get a sense of, and particularly if it's on both sides, where both players during any given game go, yeah, I felt bad about what that happened. That didn't feel, the degree, the outcome, and the tremendous amount of swing in favor of one player felt unearned for what ostensibly should have been a cheap face check punishment card whose face check just about ended the game in certain situations.
Yeah.
And notably, admittedly, and this is Seisentan is a contentious card, but unlike Seisentan, there can be times where you go, oh well, okay, the game's over. That's cool.
Yeah.
That was quick. As opposed to, I just lost 3 things. The amount of tempo that I lost doing that is just massive, such that if I can win this, I have to claw it back. So yeah, a lot of the times, a lost game that you felt like, I wish I could have just forfeited, because I ended up spending, a large amount of time trying to claw back from what was close to an unwinnable position. So yeah, a lot of which is to say that feedback of unfair is something, that has to be, that as dev will hear that and go, okay, how do we process this? It isn't immediately okay, got to rework the card or got to change the card. But in this case, that definitely heavily influenced the decision we ended up going.
Yeah, I think it's also just quickly a difference between Sorakaban Blade and Seisentan is like, against HB, you generally have a lot more latitude in how bad the face check is. Like between
for sure.
between Bioroids and like a drafter hit is bad, but it's not going to set you back. It's just going to push the court forward. And adding a new face check that means, runners now kind of have to find their sentry breaker to feel like they can like install cards and run at the same time felt like a huge. I remember feeling like a huge like, oh, this is maybe just not fun, even if it's like balanceable. Whereas like it's kind of sort of baked into the Jinteki faction identity to some extent that like you have to get your sentry breaker down early if you want to face check without risking losing a lot of cards to net damage. So it's the like how in the faction's existing pressures does the card align. I felt like it was part of the story with this card too.
Yeah. I have one thing to add on the unfair kind of train of thought here, and that's that if something feels unfair from one player, it is if the other player, so like if the runner's like, oh man, that ice is unfair, the corporation should be feeling like they outplayed the runner, right? Like that's the best set of circumstances for taking advantage of different cards like strengths and weaknesses. So in the Seisentan, like using Seisentan as an example, it is a contentious card. People don't love getting hit by Seisentan, but usually as the corporation player, you put it in a particular place and then maybe baited the runner into running it at an inopportune time and just got them. And that usually feels really, really good for the corporation. In the case of the old Blade, and the old Blade versions, it was like, okay, this only hits and almost just wins the game on the spot if the runner just so happens to have a very specific board state, not necessarily because they made a decision on what to install, but because this was the order in which they drew the cards, and because face check is only super relevant in the early and sometimes mid game. So all of that is to say that there's like different versions of unfair, and when playtesters are talking about like their feelings, hey, this felt unfair, I also am like looking at, okay, well, what did the other player feel? Did the other player feel like they outplayed them? And in which case I'm like, oh, there might actually be something like a dynamic that's really cool and really good that's going on with this card. So yeah, I'm really happy with how Blade ended up.
Yeah, so moving on from Sarakabon Blade, I think Testrunning, you had some stuff you wanted to talk about that were more from the playtesting side.
Yes. So staying with ice, but moving to NBN, there's another ice, which is piranhas. What was interesting from the playtest experience about piranhas, that sometimes there's cards that does not get played a bunch, not because they're like inherently bad, but because there's not really a niche for them, which I think something Sorokin Blade's earlier versions also had, but for piranhas for the longest time it has very similar subs to what it has now. Like the values are a bit different. Sometimes only draw, sometimes only net damage or something. But the problem were the stats, where it wasn't illicit ice yet, and it only had strength 4. And then the stat line looked very similar to Mesniteso. And also Funhouse, which also had the same stats of 5 to rest, 4 strengths, Code Gate, and NBN. So it was really hard to test this ice because you always just thought, oh, I could have just played this other ice instead, and it would have maybe have done the same thing, or like better, but better. Like either you want to tag or you want to tax the runner, and then you have 2 options for that. So there was a card where I was like very much, oh, this effect is fun, but like it just the stats of the cards don't support the actual design of the card. And then which ended up being changed to having much higher strength but being illicit. So on the surface it looks like very much, oh, they just took one in Tau and turned it around, like gave it twist. It actually arrived from a completely different position to end up there, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, I do always find it funny when I see these words like, oh, they must have designed the card this way. I'm like, no, you think we did. That would be a logical reason to design this, but the card actually went through a very kind of winding roundabout route to kind of end up with the place that looks like we could have taken a short path. And that's, I don't know, that's like some of my favorite parts of like being in playtesting and dev is just watching the winding stories of cards ending up in the places they do.
Yeah, I think this one was very interesting because for the same reason that people look at this and go, oh, this makes a lot of sense. It's a code gate. It's in the same set. It has the exact same text. You know, this is basically our logic, right? And like when we were thinking about what to do with the card, and it was starting to look like mirrored stats of Valen Chow. We were just like at the time we were thinking about how does it interact with Buzzsaw, like, you know, with its strength. Okay, we know that we don't want it to be a 5/4 because NBN already has a lot of 5/4 code gates. Okay, what about a 5/5? That's probably too good. What about a 6/6? I think 6/6 is actually one of the things we saw in testing, and 6/6 was like way too good because it didn't have it had all of the subs, but it didn't have the top line of text, so it didn't have the downside of taking a bad publicity or removing a tag. So then our options were, should it be a 7/6? And that's when in the call we just went, wait a second, it's a 6 strength code gate. You know what else we printed in this set? Valen Chow. What if we just made it a mirror to Valen Chow? I even think the subs were slightly different, and then we made it
pretend that we did that all along.
Yeah.
And now suddenly the remove attack on Valentao makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's an NBN, and we're like, oh, it's perfect.
Yeah, where thematically one is much more inclined to do one, and the one faction is more inclined to do one, the other the other.
Right. So. Exactly.
I was being a little facetious when I said, oh, how coincidental. That obviously was we noted that and went, oh, that actually works quite nicely. Consciously, that works as a fun little story, I guess. But also, again, as a balanced dial, that is, as Testrunning noted, is what ended up working out the best.
And I think in some ways, Val and Chow being out in the wild helped give us confidence that these numbers would be okay.
Yeah.
I think we are also fairly confident that this would be stronger than Val and Chow, just like without additional synergies. Resing Val and Chow for 2 is very good, but without additional synergies, I think having control of it's not necessarily easier to or more convenient to control like your hand size. There's a lot more implications. There's a lot more implications when you have piranhas stacked on top of each other. The bad publicity can't be paid into like getting through the ice like it can for Val and Chow, all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah. That led to one more thing of like piranhas and Val and Chow converging, because earlier versions of piranhas had 2 influence because it was just a different card, and like there was no reason to have higher influence. And then when it got changed to be illicit and be basically a bit better than Val and Chow, we in playtesting realized, we can just import Val and Chow, piranhas instead of Val and Chow, and I mean it's not totally broken, but it's maybe a bit too strong, and maybe a bit higher inf, which actually again mirrors Val and Chow. It was not like we wanted it to be, which just thought like we wanted it to be like Val and Chow. We just wanted to, that would make more sense for this card, and it just happened to be again the numbers on Val and Chow.
Yeah, that's funny. I had forgotten about that part of the story completely, but yeah, this was another. Yeah, it's funny how like it's sometimes there ends up being factions where we like there ends up wanting to be a lot of cards in the same space. The like 5 to res 4 strength code gate just keeps being a slot in NBN, and so this was like a fun evolution out of that slot into a really, I think, kind of interesting slot. I don't know that any of us saw the like king making piranhas style decks, but like I'm glad that someone found some synergies for those. I think that's been pretty cool. And like this drawing off turn, or like bringing some card draw back into NBN as part of its core identity in some ways.
Oh, so I actually did see it coming, and that's why during spoiler season, when there was the bingo card and they were like yellow gets no good ice, I was like, I didn't say anything, but I was like, I'm pretty sure piranhas should count as being a good ice.
I remember seeing you give a couple little pokes about that. Like, is this ice really bad? This ice doesn't seem like it's a nothing ice.
Yeah, when they're stacked on top of each other, if it's like, I think it is one of the ice that I look at and go, oh, this can be like a yellow glacier enabler. Yeah, I don't know. I really enjoy this card. I like this card a lot. It's a good ice. I swear it's a good ice.
Do we want to talk about Hollow Man a little? Because I think, like, not talking about necessarily the power level and standard, but more just like, I feel like Hollow Man had a very interesting kind of.
Hollow Man had such a journey. Hollow Man had such a journey.
Am I misspelling it?
I want to take the Hollow Man one. Oh, it's the Hollow Man, yeah.
And it's also a space. I was making it the Hollow Man. So yeah, this is the
So the Hollow Man slot came about because of another rules thing. We had a completely separate card in this slot that was in the cycle. It was an executive. It was a sysops. It moved, but we had a meeting with rules where we were just discussing all of RWR cards in general and going through the list, and the old version of the Hollow Man came up, and there would have needed to be a significant rules rewrite to allow that card to exist, and the card wasn't that compelling to begin with. So we were just like, new card slot. We actually had so many people within NSG just pitching ideas for this card slot too, because it was such an impactful card. We had people from narrative, people from SBT, of course people from design, but like it was a really like collaborative effort to try to figure out what could be a good boost to Epiphany without taking kind of at the time, the incredibly dominant NEH lists kind of over the top, especially when, NEH asset spam is basically the direct competitor to Epiphany. So there was all these different kind of ideas that were coming about, all of which had the end of turn movement as well. And I think Crofi, actually from SBT, and maybe Peter, I think there was a combination of their two, Peter, the playtest coordinator. I think that they had different pitches that we basically melded together, cut some of the abilities off of, and then that became the Hollow Man that we know today. And the very first time that I playtested it, I went, this can't move at the end of turn. It's not doing what it should be. You have no reason to move it at the end of turn. You have to like actively predict which server you're going to end up needing to fast advance in. I was like, this end of turn might as well not be here, but we want it to be a cycle. And that's when I was like, I think it should be start of turn. And that was very contentious. A lot of people did not like that we were breaking the cycle. And it just so happened to work so well narratively with the character that is the Hollow Man. We had these very defensive characters in the story of RWR, kind of defensively upgrading and being reactive. And Hollow Man is the person in the story that is proactively pushing the agendas along. So it makes sense for them to have a proactive feel rather than be reactive, and then also move at the start of turn. And then the last like chef's kiss portion of this card was that we actually had the movement ability on the bottom of the card, like everything else. And during the rules rewrite, or like rules goes through after Dev is done with all the cards and does a final wordings pass on all the cards. And this includes, changing the order of things if there's no functional kind of changes. And the order of abilities for this isn't truly functional. They moved it to the top. And I saw that and I went, that was brilliant. And it truly brings the card together. So like the Hollow Man, I'm really excited about the Hollow Man. I don't know if you can all tell, independent of like balance and all this other stuff. The Hollow Man was like just such a great example of like team collaboration across like multiple departments of NSG to like make a product that like the resulting kind of product be this like epic thing that is both like mechanically and narratively like a perfect fit within RWR.
Yeah, I'd just like to basically echo all of that and say I think the Hollow Man is I feel that it's a significant success internally because of all of the degree of collaboration within and across departments, as and like some of which was really just delightfully serendipitous, where it turned out, oh, that's the decision you wanted to go with. Well, we wanted to do that too, for balance reasons. Such that the thing that makes this different to the other moving sysops makes sense thematically, and based on how rules, noting that this is a day, this subverts the rule established by the other sysops, opted to move it to the start, ends up being like a big, just it's pros across the board. I have my own secret joy that I was directly responsible for the naming of this mysterious figure. The extent to which I will not go into detail, but aside from to say that the name was non-trivially influenced by me, and it's goofy, but again, one of those serendipitous, well, that actually turns out surprisingly well. I'm glad that they're were aspects of this card's history that ended up being so positive. For a card, notably, that this was, we knew this card had to be good. Like it went through iterations where it was substantially less palatable. This RWR was a set which went through, quite a lot of fine tuning and TLC, and yeah, this was, we knew was going to be a major player, and we wanted to make sure that the abilities were such that it allowed it to be. So I'm really glad, like say, for where this card ended up.
Yeah, I mean, it already was hinted at when the Automata initiative. There was already the flavor foreshadowing the Hollow Man, and again, it's very fortunate how all that turned out, and still fits with the with all that had to be done before the final version of Hollow Man that you know today even existed.
Yeah, this is probably the reason why I think the Hollow Man is my favorite card in the set, because of how it came to be. It's also some of the most fun I've ever had in playtesting, for what it's worth.
Yeah, it's like it's discovering discovering new play patterns of cards is like a really fun element of playtesting, and the Hollow Man has a lot of different like dynamics, which I think makes him a very interesting card.
Well, for me, the most fun in playtesting was still the old version of Working Prototype.
Of course.
Yeah, no, agreed. Next up, I think we want to talk about Window of Opportunity, which is a card that I think had like a bunch of different identities, but like I think we're mostly going to be talking about once it kind of got this like inside jobs. It was for a long time. It was sort of an inside job style effect, and it was figuring out how to make an inside job that coexist with inside job. I feel like was an interesting challenge for us. But Safer, I think we were going to turn it over to you to have some comments on this.
Yeah. So this card, when I joined the team, I knew this card as basically exactly as it was printed without the top piece of text. So you could run a server and derez a single piece of ice, and at the end of that run, or like when that run ended, the corporation could choose to res that ice at the end of it. So it was kind of this like inside job, like a different take on inside job, but also like a different take on a card like Tread Lightly, right? This kind of perennial concept that we've seen across criminal events where, you can influence the resing and deresing of ice in kind of an abnormal way and play with that. And what we've seen frequently is that those effects are rarely worth the card slot of including them in your deck. And we were kind of like okay with the card concept for a while because it wasn't offensive. But
there was some other large fires going on, and so
yeah. And towards like kind of like the back end of the development cycle, we went, is this card really good enough? Like, does this card really meet our standards for what we want to print? And I think the answer was pretty clearly no. We know that if we print this card will be played by some players at first, and as they gain more experience and like kind of realize that the card is very narrow, the card is not going to end up seeing that much play. So what we did is we originally were thinking, okay, what if we amplify the effect? There was a version where it cost 2 and it derezzed 2 pieces of ice during a run, and then the corp could re-res both of those pieces of ice. And what we found is, yes, it was more worthwhile in the card slot, but it was such a niche card that it didn't necessarily make it any more likely to be slotted. It just became more meta dependent. We're like, it's going to be great in a Glacier meta, but other than that, this card's almost never going to see play. So that's when we kind of hit the drawing board and just went, okay, let's keep it simple, because the text box was expanding with 2 pieces of ice and having to get all that worded at the same time. And I don't remember who had the idea. It was someone within dev. But we just said, what if we added an ability on top of this that allowed you to immediately combo it with Saucy and breathe some life into a TIA card that is kind of is compelling, but also kind of has that slots are hard issue. And we kind of re-released it to playtesting, and it immediately just kind of felt right, which was amazing. And it has other targets other than Saucy. It has Boomerang, which is very criminal. Or at the worst case scenarios, you can like install a breaker, and you just get this like nice click compression where it's a run event. So you can play it in Ken and other things that care about run events. You can you can be click neutral with Swift, and it has like all of these kind of synergy pieces that just made it feel like a good, compelling card, like a card that you actually wanted to slot into your deck.
Oh, yeah. I think the last point is important, that you want to have cards that like clearly support what is presented in the set. In this case, you get in a server without breaking, which supports Mercury in a way, but it also supports other kinds of Crim. And I think one other thing that Crim archetype that you didn't mention is AS and all the hardware installing Crim, where this slots very natural into, because you always have a target to install, and then the click compression becomes very consistent.
Yeah, that's a good call.
Yeah, it's there's sometimes a dev thing of like, how can we give this like a less than a full unit of value kind of effect? Like, how can we give this a +1? And this was like a case where like the +1 of install a program or a piece of hardware like really opened it up to like taking it out of being a Mercury only card that wasn't even that good in Mercury, and giving it like all these different angles it could be used for in the faction, which is I think a really cool little success of the card. I was expecting it to still see 0 play, and I've been pleasantly surprised to see that it does actually see play in like some like serious like competitively minded decks, and not feel like it's a worse than replacement slot in all board states, which is like I think also a not every card I think is aimed for competitive top tables, which is a good thing. But it's always, I always enjoy when I turn out to be wrong about how good a card is. I think that it helps me learn stuff about the game, so it's cool.
I'm also pleasantly surprised that it is seeing some competitive play. When we made the change to the card, I wasn't necessarily expecting it to see competitive play, but even still, just we knew that the card effect was at least compelling enough to be included in like casual play, or your local meta games, or think about including it in like a deck on JNet. Like, we knew that like people would actually have fun with this version of the card, and that was like good enough for us. And the fact that it happened to have enough synergy points to still see competitive play is like, honestly, it's one of a really good lesson for, I think, us. And it's actually a dial that we have already started to explore in the future with other run events that maybe are not worth the card slot by themselves. Like, that's one of like, at least for me, that was definitely like a takeaway of like, oh, this is a really great dial and knob and like a tool that we can add to our toolbox to pull out if a run event is a little bit too niche.
Speaking of niche run events, maybe we want to talk about the last card that we were planning to talk about today, I think. Which, when we say it's niche, I think and we're going to talk about trick shot in particular. People might be surprised. This seems like it's an auto 3 of in every Shaper deck, but I think it has a very different history. And I think this, like, I know, like, Dev, I don't want to downplay the work of Dev, but I do feel like this has a lot of playtester story in it. So I might turn it to Testrunning here first to talk about.
Yes. So when RWR started, there were it's still there in some capacity. There were a lot of cards in Shaper specifically that supported less common archetypes. For example, like we saw the Kid plays decks with Lobisoman, which is still there and still a great card. And Trickshot was one of those cards, which initially didn't read that much different from what it does now, but it was a lot weaker, I think, and it all like depended a lot more on prepaid voice pad because it could recur itself on successful run instead of doing another run. So you could had your basically infinite voice pad card. And then there was some point where players were like, yeah, there's a lot of fun Shaper cards, but not a lot of good Shaper cards. Where there was a very concerted effort to look at the Shaper cards and make them like how can we make them so that you actually want to play them in more generally in the strong archetypes as well. So and this is how Trickshot came to be, which, yeah, as I said, I don't think the change was a big one. It was just like changing the recursion to make another run, basically. But yeah,
My memory of the original card was it was sort of like it was kind of just like a value pile. It was like, yeah, it had
yeah,
a cost on it so that you could get prepaid voice pad value. Then you'd breach R&D, see an extra card, gain some credits, and they would be like real liquid credits. And then it would put itself on the bottom of your stack if you met certain conditions. And it was an okay card. It wasn't like super exciting. It wasn't like particularly strong, but it was like, oh, this is a tool that you can kind of build around. And I think like at a certain point we started saying it feels like all the Shaper cards in the set are in that kind of this provides a little bit of value. It's not super exciting. Like, you can build around this, but it's probably not that good. And from what I remember, also at a certain point, this art got shared in the playtest Discord
Yes.
as like
yes,
hey, this is this is going to be the art of this card, and its name is going to be Trick Shot. It had been called something else, and it actually had like free
It
wall,
was
yeah,
free
and
wall. Yeah.
and it had like we haven't talked about this at all. Every playtest card gets playtest art, and it had like actually a gorgeous like someone actually did like real time drawing a card, and I really liked that free wall art that we had. But like making the card called Trick Shot and then giving it this art, I feel like immediately like me and a bunch of the other Shaper players are like, oh wait, we can't let this good art and this fun theme end up on this card that's just kind of like, oh, I'm just going to grind out a little bit of value every time I draw this card. And it kind of felt like some dissonance. And like, I don't remember exactly, but it felt like just for the day after this art, like just the Discord was moving like constantly on
yeah,
people trying to riff on
yeah.
ideas on how to tweak this card to make it feel like it was feel like it was a trick shot and living up to this fantastic like Edmonton play piece.
I vividly remember the first time I playtested against like this version, like not exactly like this, like the values were a bit different, and I realized when they played it, oh, this is actually a trick shot. Like whatever I do here, they will still get some value and like something like either they can contest the remote or they get into R&D and I can't prevent both, because yeah, it's a trick shot.
Yeah. So this is definitely a great story of definitely like playtesters giving us feedback and just not being satisfied with a mediocre card. I wouldn't say that Dev was satisfied with it's called free wall for most of development. You were right. It was you run R&D. If you were successful, you got to access an additional card. I think you drew a card because that was like the idea. It was you would draw your next free wall, so you would have to have like multiple to go infinite, and you would gain like some credits, and then it would put itself on the bottom of your deck. And we like toyed around with these different ideas of like, okay, what if it puts it on the bottom of the deck only if you're successful, but you still get credits all the time, because one of the feedback that we heard from playtesters was, you know, Criminal has Bravado, Anarch has Raindrops, and Shaper has Into the Depths, which requires the run to be successful. And there was kind of no run event where Shapers could just like throw it out there and apply pressure. And I remember, Jeff, you actually wrote up an entire article around like the state of Shaper, that, you know, I really enjoyed the read. And it's like one of those things where like the playtesters and what they focus on like can kind of like light a fire under dev to go like to like kind of pinpoint us and go, okay, this is exactly what our players like want to see out of the cards, so we should address that, right? And how we go about it, that's like the difficult part. And what the thing that unlocked this was definitely the art. So the first time I saw the art was before we shared it in the playtest server, and I also got the name Trickshot, and I was kind of freaking out about our existing pre-wall text, because I was like, this is not a trick shot. Like, this is so not even going to feel like the art, like the current text that we have is the art or the name. And I was like, we need to change the card in some way, shape, or form. And we were looking at a lot of the suggestions that were being put in the playtesting Discord, combined with some other like NSG specific suggestions, and having so much kind of like information and idea like in brainstorming is what kind of ultimately led to this card feeling so cohesive and good. I think it's also just like another great story of when people in NSG come together and try to tackle a problem. We get really, really nice results from it. But yeah, I think like it's just such an interesting game design story, to be honest, of like some designs start with the mechanics and then you lay the narrative on top of that. And that is actually traditionally how our pipeline works, is that we have card mechanics, and while we refine the card mechanics in development, the art and narrative teams are working on the set concepts. And then when those concepts kind of get locked in and we start to see the art and get an idea of the names and the sense of place and like the people that are going to be a part of the stories, that actually then helps us do our job better. And I think those are some of the best examples of like the cards that feel the best from the set.
Yeah. Another thing about coming together when talking about Trickshot is when this general design was finalized, there were a lot of like, because there was also already a lot of discussion about Shaper beforehand that Jeff mentioned, a lot of people in playtest that wanted to get this exactly right, and the numbers were still unsure at that point. And so there was like really a time where like a lot of playtesters playtested this card, and everyone just used different numbers. Like usually for each card, it goes like iteratively, like every so often there will be a new version with some number changes. But with Trickshot, it was really like each game used different numbers, and then from there on, Dev figured out what the correct numbers on this should be. And this is the most fun, I think, when in playtesting as well, of like everyone is playtesting in parallel, basically the same card, and exchanging ideas and findings in real time.
Yeah, it's like a hard thing to do because it's like most of the time we're testing like a whole lot of cards at once. But Trickshot got to be this place where like there was only a couple cards that were being changed around that time, and this one was one of the like biggest changes. So like also I think this is less true of Dawn, but like at the time there was a lot of very excited Shaper players active in playtesting, And so seeing this card got like a lot of people who were kind of like semi-retired, had kind of were testing less often. I was about to say semi-retired, but that's not really the right term. But just like on a bit of a break, and then this trick shot change came in, and like a bunch of people kind of came out of the woodwork and were like, "I want to try it in this. I want to try it in this." And so like maybe I don't know. I don't want to speak to like its final balance, but it was a very fun experience to see everyone trying out these ideas with like slightly different numbers and like, okay, how does this feel at 0 cost? How does this feel at 2 cost? At 1 cost? Should it give 3? Like, should it be 3 and 3? Should it be 4 and 2? Like, these were like all kind of interesting discussions that happened, and it's like in many ways, it's sort of like almost what you expect when you think about playtesting of like these like deep discussions of like what every number means on a card. And those can be hard to have, but they can be a lot of fun when they happen.
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback off that I think when a change occurs that is somewhat fundamental to a card that leads to testers going, getting pep back, getting a sense of, oh, okay, I feel slightly reinvigorated. I wanna try this out. That's always really encouraging, and I think as an indicator that it's pretty apparent. I mean, lots of people have talked about it here that Shaper not just got, I shouldn't say the lion's share. I think there are other cool cards here, but Shaper certainly got a lot of really, really high impact cards, but also a lot of just fun cards. And I think Trickshot is one of them for sure. It was felt during testing, and as you note, Jeff here, a lot like the actual numbers, like the play cost, how many credits are initially placed, how many credits based on success. This is a fun card where there are a lot of dials. And I mean, in the end, I'm very happy with where this card turned out. Could have had things moved a little bit differently, but I think the fact that it has all these dials speaks to us. Yeah, really in recomposing this card, it was very much like that top-down design of, hey, okay, cool. This art, the stellar art, has given us a new mission for a card that otherwise was going to be doomed largely to the binder. And able to breathe new life into it. I guess I'd also just like to note, my apologies to the whenever a change like this does happen, where we end up redesigning a card, it means that other teams like end up going, oh, that's a bit more work for us, which I apologize for. But yeah, I think ultimately the setter is a lot better off for having this card be what it is instead of what it was prior. Free all.
Fantastic. I think with that, I've used up so much of the three of you's time. If in case this got cut, literally, I think we have people on every mate, like every NSG region. We have an APAC, we have a US, and we have a Europe here. So this was I appreciate y'all contorting schedules to make this work. I might, very quickly ask you, like, what's your, and I think some of you have said this as we've gone through, but what was your favorite card, either from the dev or playtesting side, to come out of RWR?
So my favorite card of RWR, and actually this was a card that we quote unquote thought we were done with, and then we based on some degree of discussion from narrative about wanting to introduce or reintroduce certain characters. Alarm Clock is a card that initially was a very simple card, and it still is a fairly simple card that just it does a lot of winning stuff for me in terms of the basic theme, in terms of the how it plays out very criminally. Like in terms of the fact that just it's from the competitive aspect, it's just a very good card. Yeah, I big fan. This it has synergy and obviously lends itself to be played in Mercury. Like it wins within the context of the set, making sense mechanically. It works as a thematic tie-in to characters and themes introduced in RWR, and as a longtime criminal player, like I'm a big fan of this card. Stapling something of an always be running-esque ability onto what was ultimately originally just an extra HQ run. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the card. Also, that it is the one card in the entirety of Liberation that I wrote the flavor text for. So
I think it's also one of the only cards in the Liberation cycle to keep its playtesting name to its final name.
Yep. And I think that is I don't think it's a resplendent Quetzal, but it's one of the Quetzal species on the card. So, which I am an avid birder, and yeah, Quetzal are beautiful birds.
All right, Safer, you're
Good
up
card,
next.
yeah.
Okay, so I already shared a very impassioned speech about the power of friendship and collaboration through Hollow Man. So Hollow Man is definitely my single favorite card of the entire set. For all of the stories, I also think that it's just a really exciting and powerful card that hopefully is proving to be not too powerful. So it's exactly kind of the kind of corporation win condition that that makes the game fun. It makes the game exciting and has all these kind of cool interactions and some of the best parts about like playing a card game versus other strategy games. So man, I said I wasn't going to rant more about why the Hollow Man is awesome, but I did. There's two other cards that I want to call out that we haven't talked about though, that I think are really awesome, and I really liked their development process. One is Hammer. Hammer's kind of like Hammer is intended to be like a tech card based off of its mechanics, and originally it was just had like the can't, like AIs can't break this, and our rules manager Jamie actually brought up that it's incredibly punishing for kind of janky decks when because that are usually trying to like interact with ice in some like abnormal way. And we came up with this, what Hammer is now, and buffing the subroutines a little bit to kind of compensate for that change in power. But Hammer has been one of those cards that I was pretty hot on during testing, and other testers were not as much like so hot on it, and didn't get that much buzz during like the preview season and everything. But I think it's kind of proving to be like a meta, what's the right word? Meta relevant. Sure, role player. Like
no, it is a relevant card to think about when deck building.
It's a relevant card to think about when deck building, and it's not doing the kind of the same. It's a kind of a different take on like a Wayland Sentry,
Mm-hmm.
So I really like that card. And then the other card that I want to mention is Stoke the Embers. This is one that I personally playtested a lot, and had a lot of opinions on it throughout our like playtesting experience on the exact numbers and everything. But it during testing with this and Hollow Man and Epiphany and trying to like kind of get all these things kind of worked out together, Stoke the Embers is like some of the most fun that I had while playing testing games along with the Hollow Man. And so Stoke the Embers is one of kind of my favorite cards of the set. There you go. I'm done. I'm done talking.
All right, Testrunning, we'll go over to you.
Yes. So I think alarm clock already has been mentioned, so I will choose something else. Which is amanuensis, which as a competitive player, I'm aware that it's currently not as strong of a card. But from its design, I really like how it pushes you in a different kind of attack me, especially with like all the other trap cards. But it's really like, which is why I'm a bit sad that it's didn't turn out to be as strong as it maybe could have been. But just encouraging you to float attack is really what SAP is about. And drawing cards is always fun. So I think that's something that Amanuensis taught me, how fun it is to just clicklessly draw cards each turn.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for your time. And
I just want
thanks.
to briefly. Sorry, you
No,
can
please.
do the outro thing. Amanuensis is a good shout. I didn't name it because, admittedly, I was like, oh, it's not a particularly competitive card. Maybe we planned for it in future. But no, it's a great card as well.
Yeah.
I will await when the meta is right for Amanuensis, and then I will rejoice.
You guys had a couple of plugs before we sign off, so I want to make sure y'all have a chance to put that in.
Yeah, thanks so much again for hosting this and coordinating, Jeff. So there are two things that the dev team could use from you. The first thing is that we are always looking for additional playtesters. Playtesters are incredibly vital to the process, and just as kind of, probably you've heard in some of these stories, the playtesters have a really big say in kind of what the new sets look like. Currently, we are testing Dawn, which is supposed to be a foundational set, and it is one of the most important products that NSG will release in the near future. So with that in mind, we would love to have additional playtesters come and give us your opinions. We'll probably have a link in the description to sign up. The second thing is that if you are a game designer or interested in helping with the development of Dawn and future sets, we will also be recruiting for additional developers as well. So please keep an eye out for the recruitment Null Signal Games pages. I'll probably have Jeff include another link in the description for that as well, whenever that is actually available. So yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. And I want to thank all three of you for being on. It's been a real blast. And I hope that we can have more of the three of you and other members of NSG to talk about the work that goes into making the product. I think it's an unsung story, and y'all deserve a lot of praise. And I think there's also a lot of really fun stories that can be enlightening and interesting to talk about once a product's a little bit kind of off the shelf. So yeah, thanks once again to all three of you, and I think that's going to be it. If you want to see more stuff like this, please do leave a comment, subscribe, do all of the YouTube algorithm things. I enjoy number going up, and it does also help me figure out what kind of stuff you want to see. I did get the message y'all are tired of OB game reviews, so those are going to be on the shelf for a little bit.
I'm sorry to the 2% of viewers that were relying on that content.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all, and that'll be a wrap.